Hi, here we have Prakash has to decide whether or not to test a batch of 1000 widgets before sending them to the buyer. In case he decides to test, he has two options: A, use test 1, or B, use test 2. Now test 1 costs rupees 2 per widget. However, the test is not perfect and it sends 20% of the bad ones to the buyer as good. Okay, so basically it detects 80% of the bad widgets but sends 20% as good ones. Now test 2 costs a little higher, which is 3 rupees per widget, but it brings out all the bad ones. A defective widget identified before sending can be corrected at a cost of rupees 25 per widget. All defective widgets are identified at the buyer's end and a penalty of 50 per defective widget has to be paid by Prakash. So now we have to figure out whether to test or not and which test to use, test 1 or test 2, based on the quantity of widgets that are bad or good. So let's say the number of defective widgets is X. Now first case, if we do not use test, no test. So what will be the cost if Prakash does not test it? Now what will happen is testing cost will become 0. In this case, testing cost will be 0. And since he is not testing, he will not have to correct any of these widgets. So correcting cost will also be 0. Correcting cost will also be 0, but here there will be a penalty. What will be the penalty? All these X defective widgets will be detected at the customer's end and the customer will charge 50 rupees per defect. So penalty cost will be 50 into X. So the total cost will be 50 into X rupees if there is no test. Now case 2, when he is using test 1. Now if he is using test 1, the testing cost will be testing cost is 2 rupees per widget and there are total 1000 widgets, right? So testing cost will be 2 into 1000. Obviously he will have to test all the widgets whether they are defective or not. Now after that, correction cost. Now if let's say in test 1 only 80% of the widgets will be tested as bad. So if there are X defective widgets, the test will detect only 80%, that is 0.8x widgets to be defective, and for these widgets the correction cost will be 25 per widget. So 0.8 into 25 will be correction cost, right? Now will there be any penalty in this case? Yes. Although these 0.8x widgets are corrected, but the remaining 20% of X are sent to the customer. So now penalty will be charged on 0.2x at the rate of 50 rupees per widget. So now the total cost will be 2000 for the testing cost, 0.8 into 25, this plus 0.2 into 50. This is effectively 10 and this is effectively 20. So this total 30x. This is the total cost for test 1. And finally case 3, if he uses test 2, what will be the costing? Let's see. Now for test 2, cost per widget will be 3 rupees. So testing cost will be 3 into 1000. There are 1000 widgets total. Correction cost. Now what will happen is test 2 will detect all the defective widgets and the correction cost is 25 per widget. So correction cost will be X into 25. So the total cost here will be 3000 plus 25x. There will be no penalty here because since the test is detecting all the defective widgets, all of them will be corrected and none of the defective widgets will be sent to the customer, right? So this is the total cost for no test, test 1 and test 2. So I'll erase this now and write down the costs properly. So for no test, the cost was 50 into x. For test 1, the cost is 2000 plus 30x, and for test 2 the cost is 3000 plus what was it, 25x. Okay, these are the costs. Now the first question is, Prakash should not test if the number of bad widgets in the lot is. Now when should he test or when should he not test depends on the costing. If the number of widgets are such that the no testing cost is less than these two costs, then obviously Prakash will not do any testing. So now comparing no test cost with test 1 cost, we have 50x and we have 2000 plus 30x. The number of widgets should be such that, for the first question, that Prakash should not test if the number of bad widgets in the lot is how much. So if the no testing cost is less than the testing cost, in that case Prakash will obviously not test. So 50x minus 30x is 20x, which is less than 2000. So x comes out to be less than 2000 upon 20, which is 100. So if the number of bad widgets in the lot is less than 100, in that case Prakash obviously would not want to test. So the answer to this question will be option A. Prakash will not use test if the number of widgets is less than 100. You may think that we have only compared no cost test with test 1 cost. Even if you compare no test cost with test 2, let's do that. So you'll have 50x no test cost, and let's compare it with test 2, that is 3000 plus 25x. So no test cost should be less than test 2 cost as well. So here we'll have 25x is less than 3000. So x comes out to be effectively 300 by 25 is 120. So 12 into 120 is 3000. So if the number of widgets is less than 120, then obviously no test cost is lower than test 2 cost. But in any case, he should not use either test 1 or test 2. So for that, the number of widgets should definitely be less than the lower of these two, which is 100. Option A here is the right answer, right? Now next is, if there are 120 defective widgets in the lot, Prakash should either use test 1 or not test, test 2 or not test, use test 1 or test 2, or should use test 1 only. So let's see. So here we had compared no test cost with test 2 cost, and it comes out to be 120. So when the number of widgets is 120, no test cost will be equal to test 2 cost. So in that case, he may want to use any of these two, which is fine. But what about test 1 cost? So let's calculate costs here when x is 120. So if x is 120, no test cost will be 50 into 120, which is 6000 rupees. Here this will be 2000 plus 30 into 120. 30 into 120 is 3600 plus 2000 is 5600. And for test 2 it will be 3000 plus 25 into 120. 25 into 120 is 3000. 3000 plus 3000 is 6000. So when the number of widgets is 120, the least cost is for test 1. So he should be doing test 1 over here. So he should use only test 1. Option D here is the right answer. Okay. And now coming to the third question of this set. If the number of defective widgets in the lot is between 200 and 400, Prakash, what should he do? Now, if the number of widgets is 200, let's look at the costs for each of these three options that we have. If the number of widgets is 200, this cost will be 10,000. Here the cost will be 2000 plus 30 into 200, 6000, which is 8000. And here it will be 3000 plus 25 into 200. So 5 plus 3, 8000. So if the number of widgets is 200, test 1 and test 2 costs will be same. Or actually, let's think of it in a slightly different way. I will erase all of these. So we know no test cost is 50x. Test 1 cost is 2000 plus 30x, and test 2 cost is 3000 plus 25x. Okay. Now we knew if the number of widgets were less than 100, then Prakash will not test because that will minimize his cost. Right. But if the number of widgets is more than 100, he should do some testing. Right. So obviously for this, no test should not be an option. He should either use test 1 or test 2. Now, which test to prefer at which quantity? So for that, we'll have to do comparison between test 1 and test 2. Test 1 cost is 2000 plus 30x and test 2 cost is 3000 plus 25x. Now, for preference of test 1 cost should be less than test 2 cost. So let's figure out the value of x for this. So 3000 minus 2000 is 1000 and 30x minus 25 is 5x. So x comes out to be less than 200. Now to prefer test 1, the number of defective widgets should be less than 200. So if the number of defective widgets are more than 200, then he should definitely prefer test 2. So option C would be the right answer here, that he should be using test 2 only. Okay. Moving on to the next question here. If Prakash is told that the lot has 160 defective widgets. So now from here we can say that if the number of defective widgets is from 0 to 100, then no test should be preferred. If it is from 100 to 200, then test 1 should be preferred, and for more than 200, test 2 should be preferred. This is what we can figure out from first and the third questions combined, right? Okay, so now next question is, if Prakash is told that the lot has 160 defective widgets, what should he do? So for 160 comes in the range of 100 to 200. So in this case, he should use only test 1. So option A is the right answer here. And finally, if there are 200 defective widgets in the lot, what should Prakash do? So now for 200 defective widgets, he could either use T1 or T2. At 200, you will have an equality over here. When x is equal to 200, test 1 cost and test 2 cost both will be same. So here he can use either test 1 or test 2. Option A will be the right answer for this question. Thank you.